the past, the present, and the future. That's why I named this, that's my name. And the first question we should know about is why Havana became the most important urban center in the Americas at the very beginning, in the history. And the answer is this. When we look at the very privileged position, geographic position of Cuba at the entrance of the Gulf of Mexico, and we see that the Bay of Havana is an excellent bay, we understand why the Spanish decided to concentrate here in the Bay of Havana all the ships coming from the rest of the colonies. So the idea was to concentrate the ships here in a system that they called the fleets. And the fleet was to create large convoys in order to protect them from the pirates and the corsairs. So Havana became the meeting point. This is happening in 1537, but remember Havana was founded in 1519. It was very early for the city. The city had then about 500 inhabitants. And when they had 500 inhabitants, they had 7,000 sailors in the bay. So the big pressure generated by this concentration of people was the absence of water in the area for so many people. And that's why the Spanish decided to build in Havana. The first aqueduct built by the Europeans in the New World is here in Havana, or the first engineering work. This is the main river of the city. They built a dam here, and they built an 11-kilometer canal to bring the water to the city. This diagram shows each line represents one underground tunnel like this. So as early as 1592, exactly 100 years after the discovery of the Americas, Havana had running water. And the other question was defense. Of course, if all the traders were here, pirates and corsairs were looking at Havana. Havana was permanently harassed. The city suffered different attacks. And the last devastating attack in 1555 finally convinced the Spanish to give Havana a reliable defensive system. And that's why they built the first solid building in the city was a fortress. And that fortress in the picture is the oldest fortress in the Americas today. It is the oldest building in the city, and at the same time is the only Renaissance building in Havana. After that, in 1589, they decided to build two more fortresses at the mouth of the bay. The idea was to protect the mouth of the bay and see how. They built El Morro with the lighthouse, La Punta, and they put a chain between the two shores in order to block the entrance to the bay. A little chain, a quarter-mile long chain there to block the entrance to the bay. And after that, they decided to surround the city with a wall. So now we have, you see El Morro here with the lighthouse, La Punta, the chain was here, the old fortress here, and then 3 miles of walls surrounding the city. Then the Spanish considered that Havana was ready. I mean, the protection was done. But they ignored the advice of the military engineer who was in charge for the construction of the fortresses at the mouth of the bay in the 1500s, who advised them that they should protect the other side of the bay. When we look at Old Havana, Old Havana is flat, but the other side of the bay there is a hill. And precisely this military engineer said, whoever will take that hill will take the city later. And that's what happened. In the summer of 1762, arrived here the most powerful military force ever seen in the Americas, 28,000 men from the British Navy. But the British were not full. The British never tried to get into the bay, so they did something more simple. They landed at the east of the city and they came walking, and then they occupied the hill exactly as the military engineer predicted 170 years before. They allocated their artillery here at the top of the hill, and they started shooting from here over the walls. After 2 months, Havana became a British possession. Why this? Why this big interest on Havana? The answer is again in the map of the Caribbean Basin. Cuba is the largest Caribbean island. Cuba is the richest Caribbean island. Cuba was booming at the moment because of the takeoff of the sugar industry, and the British were interested in incorporating Cuba to the trade in the area. But there was an impediment. There was a monopoly imposed by the royal house in Seville, not allowing Cubans to trade with anyone but Spain. The first action taken by the British was precisely to remove that restriction. and allowing ships to come and go freely from and to the bay. In 2-3 months, they managed to tenfold the number of ships coming and leaving Havana. But the most important consequence of the British occupation was the opening of a new commercial route, Havana, North America. For the first time, ships leaving Havana were heading North America, bringing in commodities from Cuba to North America, like molasses to Rhode Island, to distill the rum of the British Navy there, and the like. And gradually, the new commercial route became more and more important. So important that a century after, when Cuba was already the first producer of sugar in the world, the route Havana, North America was more important than the route Havana, Spain. So there was the transformation. Now the question is on the air. Where are the British? After 11 months of occupation, the British left. That explains why we don't wear Bermudas and we don't drink tea. They left because they found it here two unexpected enemies, malaria and yellow fever. But before leaving and knowing how important was Havana for Spain, they negotiated Havana for something. And that something was the whole peninsula of Florida. So 1 square mile for the whole peninsula of Florida. So since then, Havana, Florida, Cuba have been related. See, because of Havana, the Spanish Florida became British. After that, it was American. And now, it's Cuban. It's a joke.
We tell the same joke in America.
What a joke. Wow. Okay. When they, oh my God. When the Spanish recovered the city only after, they decided to correct the mistake, building at the other side of the bay. Look at that. All this is one building, a half-mile long building, 22 acres. That is the largest and the most powerful fortress built in the Americas. So we have in the Bay of Havana the largest and the oldest, both at the entrance canal of the bay. Now let's take a look at the city. When we look at these buildings and we see which date was this built, we understand that when other famous cities today were still crawling, Havana was already a consolidated city. So this is what was going on in the first half of the 18th century. Havana was booming, and at this moment we see a process of stratification in the society, because people who were born in the island gradually developed a feeling of belonging to the island and not to Spain. So they felt more tied to Cuba than to Spain, and gradually occurs an stratification in the society. They wanted to make a difference between those who were born here, and they called themselves criollos, the Creole, and those who came from Spain, who were called the Peninsulares. So from now on, there will be a clear division between criollos and peninsulares. And these criollo families started getting married. So they joined their fortunes, getting married, even to a point that there was an endogamic process, because finally they were getting married between relatives. So they created a solid economic power, and that explains the quality and the quantity of the architecture you see in the 18th century in old Havana. One of the most important actions taken by the criollos for the future was to spend money on education. So they didn't hesitate to send their descendants to study abroad in the best European universities, but not in Spain, in England, in France, in Germany, Holland, Belgium, and the like. And when this new generation came back from Europe, they came back after seeing the world, they came back with a high level of reference, and they wanted to have a piece of Europe in here, in the middle of the Caribbean, and this is Havana, a piece of Europe. And see the sophisticated level of the architecture and the scale. The building in the picture is one family house. Okay. The same page for other buildings like this. The most important religious building in the island is this, the Cathedral of Havana. But it was started by the Jesuits as a church in 1748. Later, the Jesuits were expelled from all the Spanish colonies, and then the Catholic hierarchy took over, and they decided to turn the church into a cathedral. The difference between a church and a cathedral is two bell towers. When you look at the picture, you see that the bell towers are uneven. It is because the second bell tower was added after. When the building was inaugurated in 1777, que no está fría. Que no está fría, sí.
Agua que no esté fría.
So in 1777 it was finally inaugurated. Then they moved the bishopric from Santiago de Cuba to Havana, and the place became the most important religious building in Cuba, and also the tomb of Christopher Columbus. The remains of Columbus were here until the Spanish left in 1899. If you look well at this beautiful Baroque facade, done in coral stone, by the way, a material that allowed us to preserve these buildings. Some of them are still pristine. But if you observe this beautiful Baroque facade, you note that there is a difference between this architecture and the architecture you see in Mexico, Guatemala, Peru, Ecuador. It's different. The difference is this, that in the continent you have what experts call the New World Baroque or the Latin American Baroque. A Baroque style influenced by the indigenous culture in those countries. Something that never happened here. In Cuba, Indians were very weak. They were exterminated in 30 years. So our architecture tends to be more European than Latin American. That's the difference. And this is one of the most beautiful details we can enjoy today from the colonial times, the fanlights. Since the end of the 18th century, these families started filling the arches with stained glass, and they left behind a beautiful variety of designs. It is very impressive to see some of them, like the one at the left, but perhaps it is even more impressive to see that these fanlights, these pieces of glass, were put together with wood, not lead. That's wood. This is all wood, filled later with glass. It's a sculpture. So, as you can see, criollos, for them, the sky was the limit. They were looking for the best of the best, no matter how much. And education pays. The new generation sent to Europe was excited when they discovered the new invention, the railroad. And immediately they understood the meaning of this new invention for the expansion of the sugar industry. So they did not hesitate to introduce the railroad in Cuba as early as 1837, turning Havana into the 5th city in the world to have a railroad. See that we had a railroad here 11 years before than Spain. This was the 2nd in the Americas, the 5th in the world. And in about 20 years, the whole island was covered by the railroad, and it was the last impulse for the sugar boom. We owe the railroad not only the expansion of the sugar industry, but we also owe the railroad a massive import of labor. In spite, the island had nearly 500,000 slaves. They needed more labor, and they imported about 140,000 Chinese coolies to work in the railroad, with also more than 10,000 Indians from Yucatan and more than 10,000 Irish to work in the railroad. And that explains why we inherited in Havana one of the largest Chinatowns in Latin America. Then, the 19th century is the neoclassical century. See, 18th century Baroque, 19th century neoclassical. Now, these neoclassical palaces are clearly telling us that this is a moment of the peak of the sugar production. So, about this moment, Cuba was the first producer and exporter of sugar in the world. 1/3 of the world production was here in the island. Think about how much money was made in this small place. But these buildings are not located inside. They are located out of the walls. because remember that the walls were built to protect the city, but the city was growing so fast that the walls became an impediment for the growth of the city, and ironically, they had to turn down the walls short after they were finished. And that's why you do not find these palaces, beautiful palaces from the 19th century, in the old city, but in the periphery of the old city, I mean. And look at this. This is an example of one of the characteristics of the Cuban people. The tendency to exaggerate about everything. When you visit Cuba, sooner or later people tell you, no, Cuba is the most beautiful place in the world. We have the most beautiful beaches. We have the best music, the best food. Not the baseball team anymore. These, the most beautiful women, the most handsome men.
We've said that.
And this is an example of that tendency to exaggerate. Look at that. At that moment, 1871, the city had 150,000 inhabitants. So they wanted to have a place for their eternal rest, and they decided to build a cemetery as big as a golf course. We're talking about 140 acres of marble from Italy. Think about it. It was built like a city. That's why necropolis means the city of the dead. And think about 60 blocks of marble from Italy. 60 blocks. The cemetery has more than 1 million tombs. Even today there's room enough. So if you haven't seen it, my recommendation is to go there and take a look. Don't stay, just take a look. Okay, and with this tendency to exaggerate, we enter the 20th century seeing another incredible surprise. What is that building doing in Havana? Oh, you say, hey, we have a similar one in Washington, D.C. Yes, this is a replica of your Capitol building, but ours is taller than yours. So we have 2 meters more. So we have a Capitol, we have in Havana a replica of the American Capitol building, and so on. But not only the Capitol, behind you find the beautiful Opera House, and if you want to see you want to have a beautiful moment, take a walk along this street at Prado. The final segment of the street is covered by trees, and when you start walking that way toward the sea, because that promenade is by the mouth of the bay. It's a nice walk because you walk along the street, and at the end you have 2 fortresses from the 1500s, so it's a very nice walk. But when you start walking, you have the sensation that you're not in Havana, you are walking along a Rambla in Barcelona. Because that is Havana sometimes, that it has that European mystique. So the 20th century is the moment of Havana. Many beautiful and sophisticated buildings like Art Deco and other styles. But the most important shift in the 20th century is this: the arrival of the modern movement. After the Second World War, we see a shift. Until now, there was an influence from the European architecture. From now on, it will be American influence. And the high rises and this area, for example, was transformed. And see something interesting. Look at the small picture. It was taken in the early 1950s. Hotel Nacional, the shoreline here, the sea, the shoreline, but there was nothing around. See, was almost everything was vacant. But suddenly this. And look at the dates. In 3-4 years, the image of Havana was changed dramatically. And that is because of the intervention of the mafia. When American mafia families came here to Havana to implant their gambling business, because after visiting Havana and it was a meeting here at that Hotel Nacional, let me tell you, it was about 200 members or representatives of the mafia families. It was a big convention, but not convention is not the word. a meeting. And after that, the decision was, okay, Havana is very near to the US, but far away from the FBI and the IRS. Havana is perfect. It's a perfect place. And that's why they, after the Batista seized power and the coup of 1952, the city was open for the mafia to bring their business. And gradually they started building hotels, casinos, gambling houses everywhere. And see the boom. It's evident that this boom has to do with money laundering. Because even the pressure generated for this was so big that they managed to change the zoning. It was not allowed to build more than 3 levels in Vedado, and suddenly this. But in spite of that prosperity, the prosperity that brought gambling to the city, people didn't like gambling. And that explains why on January 1st, 1959, in the morning, people invaded the street to celebrate. About this time, all the streets were full of people cheering, celebrating. And one of the first spontaneous actions taken by the people that morning was to destroy all the casinos and gambling houses. That morning, people threw in the middle of the street all the belongings of the casinos and burned them. So Vedado, especially this area, showed many bonfires. At the end of this promenade, you have the Riviera Hotel, built by Mayor Lansky. So all the belongings were burned in the middle of the street, putting an end to the gambling era. Curiously, the other victims of that people's rage were the parking meters. With the same rage and dedication, people destroyed all the parking meters in the city. Welcome to a city free of gambling and free of parking meters. Not for long. Not for long. Now, when the revolution came, other topics will appear. We leave behind the high-rise residential buildings, and now we have something different. Education and the like. Look at the small picture, a historical picture. This is Fidel Castro, this is Che Guevara playing golf at the former golf course of the former elitist Havana Country Club, whose members were already gone. So the area was abandoned and they were wondering what to do with the area. And finally the idea was to build these schools of arts, a complex of buildings that have become the most celebrated architectural work done in Cuba ever. After this, or in parallel, many scientific buildings were built to the west of the city, creating what we call the scientific pole of the West. That area is covered with research and development institutions, biotechnology, genetic engineering, medical research, and the like. And more or less in parallel appears a new tendency. The tendency is that Cubans discovered prefabrication, and immediately people said, okay, this is a magic, or this is a key for the solution of all the problems, all the demand of buildings. Prefabrication can be the ultimate solution. So that was detrimental for the kind of work like the schools of arts, but that allowed to massify the construction. It was good in this case, like the first Polytechnic University built in Havana. Havana had 1 university in 1959, today it has 12. That was the first built after the revolution. And the use of prefabrication in housing was not good because the result was dull and monotonous neighborhoods, so it doesn't make sense to show that except this case to the east of the city, the rest doesn't make sense to be shown. Yeah. Now, the revolution came. What happened then? See, you want to create a new social order of justice and equity, but the city was there before, and that's important. Among those goals is to eliminate housing as a business, and you want to forbid eviction, gentrification, and homelessness. So the first we need to know is what kind of city was inherited by the revolution. What kind of Havana was there before? Okay, nothing better than the scale model of the city, because the scale model of Havana is color-coded. So the model will allow you to understand how many buildings from the colonial period remains and how many buildings were built between the colonial and the revolution after the revolution. So if we, well, this is small, but here by the bay there is a reddish spot. Everything you see in reddish belongs to the colonial period. Then yellow color covers all the buildings built between the colonial and the revolution. And immediately you realize the scale model is yellow. And that means, listen to this, that means that 80% of Havana was built between 1900 and 1958. This city was built in less than 60 years. Very fast and very well. Okay? But if you have a city built in the first half of the 20th century, then the city is aging at the same time. And this is the question. The average age of the housing stock in Havana today is 75 years. And because of this, you have many houses collapsing every day. 3 at least. More than 1,000 a year. But remember, no homelessness. According to the law, there cannot be homeless. So the city government is obliged to provide accommodation to the people who lost their houses. And this is the question. You have 11,000 people living in provisory housing or temporary housing, but see the waiting list, 120,000. 120,000 means an average city in Cuba. But this is a big burden for the city. Go anywhere in the city, go anywhere, you will never see a homeless. That is not allowed by the law. People need to be accommodated somewhere. That's one of the rules in the city. Now, which were the steps taken after the revolution in order to eliminate the housing as a business? Okay, first, rents were reduced by 50%, allowing more people to have access to the housing stock, or allowing other people to improve their living standards, having access to better housing. And the most important law is 1960, when the urban reform. The urban reform nationalized all the urban property used for business, allowing the people later to become the owners of that. In 1970, a very popular self-help construction movement, and it is the micro brigade. Micro because it was groups of 30, 35 people. The idea was to build 1 apartment per person per year. The incentive to get your paycheck during the time you were working on your own apartment. Nothing better than that, to be paid for building your own home. And that allowed thousands and thousands of people to become the owners of their houses. So we have thousands and thousands of people. Now, if there is no market price, what do you pay to become the owner of a house? You pay a value. And the value is set according to the age, the size, the condition, and the location of the house. So once the house, the value of the house is set, you have 20 years to pay. No interest, no mortgage. See, as a consequence of this, 90% of the housing stock in Havana is private. 9 out of 10 families in Havana are the owners of their house. They do not pay rent. But a curiosity, you can own the apartment. If you live in an apartment building, you can own the apartment but not the building. When I was preparing this, I was trying to find out who is the owner, what kind of ownership is the building. Because the buildings are not a condominium, are not cooperative.
Right.
What are they? I don't know. I haven't found yet a clear definition. Okay, because think about it. You have an apartment building with 10 different apartments, 10 different owners, owning the parts. But who owns the whole? Some people say the state. How's that? That the owner of the whole is one and the owner of the parts is... What is that? I haven't found yet the answer. Maybe he knows. So, owner owners are responsible for the maintenance of their house. Of course, that's according to the law. You are responsible to maintain what you own. That's in the law. But the owners of apartments in a building do not feel responsible for the building.
Right.
And that is what you have to pay for that legal limbo. In other words, our apartment buildings do not have an administration. And that explains why tenant boards are not effective. Now, we saw a moment ago how easy it is to become the owner of a house. But now let's find out how difficult it is to maintain what you own. Suppose you're a Cuban earning a monthly salary of 300 pesos. That equals 12 convertible pesos at the present rate. And then you want to paint a gallon of paint. You can pay that in CUC, convertible pesos, or in pesos. But the question about buying a gallon of paint is this. It means 45% of your monthly income. Whatever your income is, what do you mean by spending 45% of your monthly income just buying a gallon of paint? You paint or you eat.
Right.
Unless you prepare a soup of paint. So this is the big contrast between owning and maintaining. See? And when you look at the rest, it's more than 45%, it's even more. So a simple operation for a person earning that, with that earning, it's very complicated. Very complicated. So on the next slide, we'll show you the stratification in the society. It's something that is a phenomenon, especially when we enter in the so-called special period. And look at this. Suppose we have a group of people that are going to buy the same thing. How much of their income they need to spend to buy that? Look. If you are a person with a minimal pension, you need 48 days. A professor 21, a state worker 17, a doctor 11 days. And we suddenly discovered that a butcher in a free market needs only 4.5 days. So this butcher is making 3 times more than the doctor. Right?
Yeah.
And if you are self-employed, like now is a tendency to expand the self-employment, you need less than a day. In other words, this person is earning at least 50 times more than this. So we have a big disparity between the lowest and the highest income. But now there is a surprise. Take a look. Who is building more? In whose hands is the housing business? Individuals. So see the contrast. We have in this end, people who cannot afford to buy a gallon of paint, and here now we have thousands of people with money enough to build a new house. Mm-hmm. I give you a hint. The construction cost of new construction is 300 convertible pesos. 300 convertible pesos per square meter. It's about 30 per square feet. Think about it. The average house is 60 meters, 600 square feet. $18,000, $20,000. So we have people who cannot buy a gallon of paint, and suddenly we have a lot of people with $20,000 in their hand in capacity to build the house. Look at these statistics. They don't lie. That's very interesting. Because many people may assume, okay, no, it's in the house of the state. No, it's in the house of individuals. Well, and now this will help you to understand what do we mean by the special period. Because the graph starts in 1990, the moment of the collapse of the Soviet bloc. Remember, Cuba was a member of the Comecon, the Council for Middle Economic Aid, that gathered Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, Vietnam, and Cuba. Within the Comecon, the trade was barter trade, no money. And within the Comecon, Cuba had a status, the status of a non-developed country. So because of this, Cuba got preferential prices for its commodities. What I mean, when in the world market, the sugar price was 8-9 cents, Comecon was paying 30-35 cents per pound of sugar. So that allowed the country to expand its capacity, purchase capacity. And the same pays for the imports. And the Comecon was always open to buy all the sugar Cuba was able to produce. This, plus soft credits, long-term agreements, technical assistance, the economy was okay. Everything was okay. But all that collapsed overnight. And suddenly, a year after, we were back in the world market, trying to allocate the sugar at world market prices. Our former allies became just suppliers who demanded to be paid now in hard currency. It was a very bad moment. All the benefits were gone, just like this. And we were naked. See how the economy was plummeting. In 3 years, I mean from 1990 to 1993, the number of buses in Havana fell from 1,500 to 300. The oil import in Cuba fell from 14 million tons in 1990 to only 4 in 1993. Blackouts were every day, 12 hours, 14 hours, 16 hours. Unemployment 40%. Everything was very bad. A very bad situation. And all this has been called with a very pompous, I call it a pompous name, the special period. The special period was the other one. The previous one was very special. This has nothing special. Well, especially when we recall those days. But see, there is an inflection. The economy recovered suddenly. What happened then? In 1993, the city was literally flooded with dollars because Cuban emigres started sending money to their families to help them. And they showed an outstanding capacity to send billions of dollars under the table. But the city was flooded with dollars. There was a big black market in the city and people were trading $1 150 pesos. In 1993, I was earning $2 a month. I'm still here. I survived. But that was the question. I mean, so in order to stop this, the government decided to legalize the circulation of the US dollar in parallel with the Cuban peso. So 1993 is the beginning of the dual currency in Cuba. Now this summer we will celebrate the 20th anniversary of the dual currency in Cuba. So you have now a new source of income, remittances, plus foreign investment, plus self-employment to reduce the unemployment, and the economy booms again. But it shows a pattern of I call it the roller coaster pattern. It's up, down, because it's very fragile. So this means that we are still in a period of crisis. Okay? The worst is behind, but we are still under a period of crisis. Now, if you move forward very fast, you leave behind the built environment. Then the built environment was in very bad condition, like this. Look at the colonial buildings. They were in this condition, many of them. So unless you have a comprehensive plan that implies to develop your own technical force, your skilled labor, to guarantee your own supplies, and the most important, to make your own money, you cannot transform this into this. Or this. Look at this, St. Francis of Assisi Church. This church was confiscated by the Spanish in the 19th century. It was later turned into a stable, a warehouse, whatever. So now is this. Now it's a concert hall for chamber music. But let's go back for a moment. Take a look. See that the back wall is flat, right? Look again. This is painted. It's a paint. It's a trompe-l'oeil. Very well done. Very well done. When you visit the place, you see, there's something funny here, but I don't know what. I know. There's a trick here, but I don't know where is the trick. Very well done. Okay. Now, one ambitious project. Look at the old square, the only residential square in New York City. I mean, this is a picture before the restoration started. See, still traffic in the streets. Look, there's a ruin here, a tenement here, a tenement here. All these very ugly park. The rest of the buildings a cane. But after 10 years of work, is this.
Yeah.
Not bad.
Exactly.
Not bad. Remember the ruins in the corner? Look at that. Very animated. There is a microbrewery. That's why I call that the corner of joy. If you pass by, everybody, hi! People are very happy. Okay. And from the 20th century, we have many buildings, like beautiful buildings like this. This is a former Spanish society. Today, it's a wedding palace. Now, after the restoration, is this. Nice? But the wedding hasn't changed. The same. Now, how important is Havana for Cuba? This is basic. See, Havana is less than 1% of Cuba, but the city concentrates 1/5 of the population of the island. And very important, see, 1/5 of the population of Havana is above 60. 1 out of 5 people in the city are already above 60 and counting. We have 380,000 retirees in the city. See that we have the largest concentration of professionals, 28%. That Havana contributes with 51% of the income from tourism, is the largest touristic destination. That Havana alone contribute with 45% of the GDP. The late tell us that the distance between Havana and the rest today is enormous. See, Cuba is getting old, older and older. The population is not growing anymore. Now we have more diseases than birth. And this is because the two basic indicators here, fertility rate and gross reproduction rate. If we do not manage to change that, the aging process will continue, unstoppable. See, it doesn't matter if we have the lowest, because some people say, no, but we have the lowest infant mortality in the Americas. Yes, that is not the case. The case is this. You need to change the fertility rate and the gross reproduction rate in order to revert this situation. And adding to the aging, we have migration. See, Havana is the largest supplier or the largest emitter of migration abroad. 65% of the people who leave the island, they leave from Havana City. This has two implications. One, that they will turn Havana into the largest recipient of money from outside. When you combine that 51% of the income from tourism plus the largest recipient of remittances, the big money ball is in Havana. And that means that people feel attracted to come to the city. Who is leaving? The question here is not the quantity, it's the quality. Young people between 25 and 35 with high education. There is a brain drain. In the other end, who is coming? Whoever. Hustlers, wherever. People who come to the city to see what they can find here. And a question about the migration in is this. If you try to criminalize that migration, the people become invisible. They dive into the underground economy, and they are there, you don't know exactly where. And only when you look around you see that they are there, because if they cannot settle formally, they will do it informally, and that means shanty towns. Okay? Now, a walk. See, if you live in an apartment building without administration and like this, in which you see that the owners of these buildings, of these apartments, seems to love red color, so they decided to have their own balcony in red. So, woman in red? No, balcony in red. Okay. For this. You have many qualified buildings in the city like this. You cannot leave in the hands of the owners the restoration or the maintenance of these buildings, because it is very expensive. You need expertise. You need qualified labor in order to preserve the values of the Art Nouveau. So you need to support that. If there is support, there will be Art Nouveau. But if there is no support, instead of Art Nouveau, there will be Art Pauvre. The owners solve the problem their way they can, not the way they want. Think about replacing, putting there another wrought iron balustrade. How much it will cost? A lot. So in one way or another, what they do is to degrade the buildings. That's important of supporting different, in spite that these buildings are private, it makes sense to support that because it's the value of the city, not the value of the house. And this, the prince and the pauper. Why? Until the dual currency, these families were living on their income. But after that, there is a difference. The people to the right remembered that they had a brother in Miami who can send them money. And if we assume that if the average salary in Cuba today equals $20 a month, what about if I send you $100 a month? I would be sending you 5 monthly salaries in one round. A gallon of paint, no problem. Cement, this, whatever. I can keep my house, you can't. And this is the urban expression of the question. That you see neighbors seeing that there are big disparities between them. So it's more detrimental for the other one that they see that the neighbors are moving up not because they work harder, but because they have someone sending them money. And we have that urban expression, what I call the prince and the pauper. And this, architecture. Now you know what money and bad taste can do. I repeat, I always say, intelligence has its limits, but ignorance doesn't. I would like to hear the opinion of Freud about that. And this is very important. Yeah. See, this scenario, the decline of the sugar industry. Cuba is not anymore the sugar power. Okay? What used to be for centuries the backbone of the Cuban economy, not anymore. But we see the rise of tourism. So tourism is now what sugar used to be. But it's important to keep in mind that when you produce sugar, you're producing a commodity in the countryside, while tourism means to provide a service in urban areas. With this in mind, let's take a look at some of the changes that are taking place in Cuba today. One of the ambitious goals in the reforms now introduced by the government is to reduce the bloated state payroll by 500,000. The only way to relocate these people is to expand the private sector. Very ambitious, in my opinion. This sounds too ambitious, but anyway, that's sufficient. The other very important question that will affect the city in one way or another is food. In Cuba, at the moment, 50% of the arable land is idle. 50%. But Cuba spends a lot of money importing food from abroad. Things that are easily to produce are now imported. See how the government is trying to stop that, incentivizing people to migrate from the city to the countryside, giving them the possibility to settle there. There's a land lease now. And lately there have been also an incentive for foreign developers to come and start their real estate business, extending the land lease from 50 to 99 years. And it is important to remember also that since November 2011, it's possible to buy and sell houses in Cuba. With this in mind, we can take a look at the future to see the possible and the predictable. There could be a sudden increase in the number of tourists because more Americans. Today, the largest emitter of travelers to Cuba is Canada, 1 million a year. The second, US, 500,000. Every year, 400,000 Cuban Americans and about 100,000 Americans travel to Cuba. But that can change. Perhaps this is a momentum to improve the relations or even to normalize the relations between Cuba and the United States. I'm not endorsing the idea that the lifting of the embargo will stay there. But now, what I see in the short run is a relaxation in the restrictions to travel to Cuba. There is a permanent pressure from the industry in the US who see the Virgin Island there and the many possibilities that can bring that. Recently, according to the ASDA, they see 1.5 million soon. Whenever that